You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
It's December the 1st, 2018. The location is Vancouver Airport. Canadian authorities have just arrested the chief financial officer of Huawei, China's largest telecommunications company and the world's second largest seller of smartphones after Apple. She, of course, is not just the CFO of Huawei. She is Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of Ren Zhengfei, the founder and CEO of Huawei. What begins is a courtroom drama that continues to this day. But it is also part of what has become known as the US-China tech war, and a particular battle over which company and which nation gets to set the international standards for 5G technology. It's resulted in the United States increasingly shutting off access to high technology components for China, as well as asking other nations to shut Huawei out. Welcome to Inside China. My name is Kinling Lo. Today, we're going to hear more about the future for Huawei, as well as an update on what has become a 2-year courtroom battle over the extradition of Meng Wanzhou to the United States. But first, let me remind you of 2 things. We took a close look at Huawei a couple of months ago in August, and it's well worth your time to revisit that episode for the background into this drama. And second, like all things involving news and the year 2020, if anything changes between the time of me recording these words and you hearing them, well, you'll read the latest on SCMP.com as part of our 24-hour news coverage. Today, you're going to hear from John Artman. He is the technology desk editor for the South China Morning Post, and he's going to bring us up to date on exactly what happens next for Huawei. And then, we are headed to Vancouver to hear from our senior correspondent, Ian Yang. He's covered the ongoing drama surrounding Meng Wanzhou pretty much every single day for the past 2 years, and he's going to take us into some of the drama and shock revelations he has written about. But first, let's get John on the line. So John, I want to start with the question we asked you back in August, because I really think it's worth revisiting. Is the US government trying to contain Huawei or kill it?
Well, I don't think that they're trying to kill Huawei. That much has actually become quite clear since we last spoke. Basically, what the U.S. government in particular is trying to do is keep Huawei out of 5G, and what that means is basically trying to, on the one hand, really stymie their smartphones, and so a lot of the newer smartphones need specific 5G chips. And then, of course, also when it comes to the rollout of 5G networks around the world, it's very clear that one of the big reasons that Huawei was put on this entity list was exactly that, to make sure that it could not actually be involved to a great extent in building out telecommunications networks of the future. It does seem that Huawei does have enough chips for some of their smartphones next year. And they do have enough chips more than likely for the rollout of 5G inside of China. But currently, it doesn't look good in any other regard. And so, you look at recently, a few companies were given licenses to sell chips to Huawei. Qualcomm is a great example. But in that instance, they were only given a license to sell 4G chips. So like I said, I think that since we last talked, it's quite clear that really the strategy is containment, not death. And so on the one hand, that's good news for Huawei. There's still a viable way to keep their business going, whether that's 4G smartphones, whether that's doubling down on other kind of more basic types of equipment that don't need cutting edge chips. But it does look like that in terms of kind of cutting edge or leading edge technologies, there's really no clear path forward for Huawei at the moment.
The US has been increasingly targeting the supply of silicon chips to China. And just a couple of weeks ago, we saw Huawei sell off its Harmony brand of phones. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, basically what it means is that they won't have this smartphone brand kind of dragging them down. Again, I mean, they've stockpiled chips, some of the latest leading edge chips, so that they can continue to produce leading edge smartphones into next year. But if they were to try to, keep the Honor brand innovating, that would be impossible. I mean, they wouldn't be able, they would not have enough chips. Is just what it comes down to. And so rather than killing the brand, they decided to spin it out basically and sell it. Now, ostensibly, the company that bought Honor was organized through a consortium of Honor dealers and companies that are very invested in selling the phone. But interestingly enough, once the org structure became clear, there's actually quite a few former Huawei employees working for this company and leading the Honor brand. Ren Zhengfei, in an internal speech at a farewell party for Honor, basically said that he really hopes Honor turns into a strong competitor against Huawei. So I think that there's still a lot of questions around the future of Honor. Will this separation convince lawmakers and policymakers in the United States that there is indeed a real separation? I think is a really big question. Again, given the nature of some of the new employees of this company, but we can only guess as to what the actual relationship is now between Huawei and Honor. But on the surface, at least, it does look like they're completely separate companies.
So, does Huawei have any desire to get back into the U.S. market for smartphones, or are they just going to focus on selling phones in mainland China?
First of all, I mean, China is Huawei's number one market, and in fact, the Chinese market actually allowed them to surpass Samsung this year in terms of global shipments. But the second largest market for Huawei was actually Europe. And so this is one of the things. I mean, so when Google stopped working with Huawei, so Huawei cannot have Google services running on Android now. That was a pretty big hit. Obviously, if you're in mainland China, it doesn't matter because Google services are not actually allowed in versions of Android that are sold in China. But the rest of the world, if you're buying an Android device, you expect to be able to have Gmail, Google Search, Google Calendar, all these even Google Voice, all these different services. You expect to have those right out of the box. And in fact, for many people, that's one of the reasons they go with an Android phone is for the Google on the back end. So this has been a big problem for Huawei outside of China. But again, domestically, their sales have been quite strong.
John, we have published quite a few articles over the past few months about this concept in mainland China called revenge buying. So it means making consumer purchases a patriotic duty, either to help the economy recover from the pandemic or, in the case of Huawei, to give support in the face of U.S. sanctions. Have you seen that kind of response for Huawei products in mainland China this year?
Well, I think that the hype has definitely died down. So we don't really see social media posts and kind of, these videos and things like that. But again, I think if you look at global shipments, I mean, global shipments, Huawei is, at the top of the list now. And again, one of the reasons is the strong demand from Chinese consumers. And I think Huawei is a really interesting company. I remember when they first launched their smartphones, I was very skeptical. Honestly, my first reaction was, what in the heck is, a telecommunications equipment company and a network device company? What are they doing going into smartphones? And so this was back in it must have been 2009, 2010, around the time when Xiaomi was launching, and there was a lot more kind of lower end brands, and it was the flowering of a 1,000 Android flavors. But we can see that they were extremely serious about it, And when Huawei gets serious about a product or a product line, man, they really do it. And so you look at the history of Huawei smartphone development. They partnered with Leica for the cameras. They've gotten some pretty big celebrities to do endorsements and advertisements and things like that. And so I'm not an Android guy, but from what I understand, I mean it's especially their middle to high end phones, they're quite good. And especially these days, obviously iPhone is still a bit of a status symbol, especially when there's a new form factor. You can see that sales really spike in China when Apple launches a new form factor. So when the phone looks different. But at the same time, there are a lot of higher end devices coming from Chinese companies, whether it's Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a pretty strong appetite for those phones. So it's definitely on the high end. It's no longer Apple. That's for sure.
Our colleagues on the US-China Trade War podcast have been talking about the hand grenades that Donald Trump is throwing on his way out of the White House. And last week, he threw a big one when he brought in new restrictions on exports of high-end computer chips to China. Would you unpack that for us? How serious is it?
So recently, CNOOC, which is China's offshore oil company, and SMIC, the number one chip maker in China, were both added to that entity list. And this is really bad. I mean, for SMIC, it's really bad. I do think that there are. SMIC is not the only one, not the only company making chips, but certainly it is a front runner, and so it's really bad. I don't know how best to describe it, but basically what this means is that SMIC can no longer purchase firsthand equipment. It can't even purchase secondhand equipment in order to create more leading edge chips. And so what this does is it really kind of forces SMIC. That's what we call it sometimes, SMIC. It's just a bit easier. What this does is that this means that basically, unless they can find some kind of gray area workaround to buy secondhand or third-hand equipment somehow, I mean, they're basically stuck with what they have. And we can see that, ASML, the leading lithography machine maker, they have a machine that can make the most advanced semiconductors at 7 nanometers. And they're working on 5 nanometers as well. The Dutch government has not given them a license to sell to any Chinese company. And so if a Chinese semiconductor fab wanted to get a ASML equipment, they would need to buy that secondhand. And actually, we ran a story about that a few months ago. SK Hynix, they sold through a broker in Singapore, they sold a secondhand ASML lithography device to a company in Suzhou. And so we can see that this is definitely happening, that Chinese companies are doing their best to get some of this leading edge equipment. But the problem for SMIC right now is that, they're on this entity list and what the Trump administration has done over the last few years is close a lot of these loopholes. So first it was, no American company can do business directly with them. And so that meant that Qualcomm and Intel, et cetera, could not deal directly with these companies. So they the Chinese companies went through, a second or third party in order to make these deals happen, resellers and things like that. But now what this means is now that that loophole has been closed, which means that basically no American equipment, period, can go to these companies. And so if they are getting this equipment, that means they're finding people to help them skirt the entity list, basically, going against American policy. So I think that, in order for SMIC and other companies to stay at the leading edge, or at least to not fall completely behind, they're going to have to find some kind of workaround, and I'm pretty confident that they will.
Sounds like some interesting times ahead for, well, like you guys in the tech world call it SMIC, but it's the China's Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. But what's the impact on Huawei? Can it survive having the supply of semiconductors choked off?
When it comes to Huawei, again, 90% of their business doesn't necessarily need some of the cutting edge technology that the U.S. government has cut them off from. But really what it means, Huawei was, setting standards. They helped to create global 5G standards, which was an amazing smart strategy because they're coming at that market at pretty much all angles you could possibly think of, right? So they have the 5G base stations that they developed. They have the smartphones. They also have wearables that eventually are going to, be powered by 5G somehow. Like I said, they were a leader in a lot of this technology innovation and adoption and commercialization as well. And it looks like they're just going to completely lose that unless they can find some way around it. Now, again, the company itself will survive. 90% of their business doesn't need this cutting edge technology, but they're not going to be able to be as aggressive, and I think they're not going to be able to grow the way that Ren Zhengfei I think really kind of hoped. And of course, with his daughter in Canada and her fate kind of really up in the air. I mean, who knows when he's going to retire? I've heard speculation that if the negotiations that were reported on earlier this week, if they are true, or excuse me, if the negotiations reported on late last week, if they are true, I've heard speculation that if Meng does return to China, that Ren will retire because he is quite old, and to be honest, he's not that involved in the day to day. But I do think that there's Meng was more than likely supposed to take over from him, and so that succession plan has obviously been completely stymied. And so I think that's the big question that we're all asking, and we don't have any good answers. Is kind of what does Huawei look like next year? At this point, a shell of their former selves is about all I can say. I think it's from just kind of in general, it's tragic to see a company that was doing so well be really kind of hamstrung by politics.
We are going to talk about Meng Wanzhou in just a second with a man in Vancouver. But John, to finish, I have to ask you. With all this attention on Huawei and the sanctions and restrictions being put on it by the US, have there been any competitors either in the West or in mainland China who have stepped up to take advantage of this situation?
That's a great question. This is the problem. One of the reasons that the US wanted to hobble Huawei is because, they were one of the only companies actually building out the next gen networks. That's the thing, you don't have very many companies actually engaging in this. I mean, the second best is going to be Ericsson, but Ericsson, isn't as strong as or as successful as they used to be. So obviously now, yes, there is more space for other competitors in terms of leadership, non-Huawei leadership and kind of the telecommunications innovation and adoption. It's hard to see, who's really going to take over their spot. Now, when it comes to smartphones, I mean, Chinese companies have been very aggressive. The founder and CEO of Xiaomi, specifically said that they're going to be increasing their efforts in Europe. As I said before, the EU used to be a pretty big market for Huawei. So if Xiaomi can move aggressively there, and if Xiaomi can move aggressively in India as well, where there's a high demand for budget and mid-end phones, they can very, I think, quite easily, fill up a lot of that demand that Huawei just won't have the capacity to take advantage of anymore.
That's John Artman, the editor for the technology desk here at the South China Morning Post. You can find him on Twitter at knows nothing, but as you just heard, he knows quite a few things.
In 2019, Hong Kong witnessed social and political upheaval that rocked the city to its foundations, setting off shockwaves that continue to reverberate today.
The people knew that this is so dangerous. Anybody could be just brought back to China for trial.
The definitive documentary on the Hong Kong protests offers an in-depth look at the dramatic story of a city at a crossroads. It draws from extensive video footage, exclusive interviews with those caught up in the conflict, and unparalleled access to ground zero reporting by our award-winning journalists. China's Rebel City is a companion presentation to the book Rebel City, Hong Kong's Year of Water and Fire, that was published by the Post in June. You can watch China's Rebel City online, on demand, on YouTube, Facebook, or the South China Morning Post homepage, scmp.com.
So now, let's go to Vancouver. Ian, take us back 2 years ago. Tell us where you were on the night of December the 1st, 2018.
Yeah, what happened was I actually received a phone call from Hong Kong, from my editors in Hong Kong, letting me know that there was a rumour that a very high-placed executive named Meng Wanzhou had been apparently detained at Vancouver's airport. Now, I'd never heard of Meng Wanzhou at that stage, but when I heard that she was the chief financial officer of Huawei and that she was supposedly the daughter of Ron Zhongfei, the founder of Huawei, I knew that this was going to be a massive story. So it's turned out to be. It's kind of dominated my reporting life for the past 2 years.
If I ask you to use just one word, how would you describe what you've witnessed in the past 2 years with the Meng Wanzhou case? Circus, sideshow, or saga?
Oh, it's definitely a saga. I mean, this story kind of puts Vancouver at the cutting edge of the biggest story of the past half century, which is the rise of China and how the rest of the world confronts the rise of China. And what we see in Meng Wanzhou and her arrest and her attempted prosecution by the Americans, I think, is the embodiment of that great clash. And certainly the Chinese side, at least, see this case as an expression of American foreign policy. They see Canadians' willing participation in it in the form of having her arrested and, going ahead with this extradition case as an expression of Canada's lapdog status towards the United States. And they see Meng Wanzhou as having been terribly wronged in all of this. Now, the American position, of course, is quite different. The American position is that Meng Wanzhou is accused of a crime and they simply want to put her on trial for that. But of course, it's not quite that simple.
It's 2 years of a courtroom drama, but this week also marks the second anniversary for 2 Canadian citizens who were arrested and jailed just days after Meng Wanzhou was arrested. They have been denied access to lawyers, denied access to their families. How has that played out in Canada?
Yeah, the fate of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is absolutely dominating Canadian discourse about how Ottawa needs to deal with China and how Canada needs to develop a China policy. And the goal really is of Canada's approach towards China at this moment is largely geared towards getting Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor home. Now, the Chinese have said that the detentions of Kovrig and Spavor don't actually have anything to do with Meng Wanzhou. They don't actually have anything to do with foreign policy even. But the Canadians, at least, certainly regard their treatment as hostage-taking, as hostage diplomacy by China. And Justin Trudeau and his government, they're very keen to not be seen to be rewarding hostage-taking, as they see it, on the part of the Chinese.
The Beijing authorities allowed the Canadian embassy to contact the men in October this year in their prison cells. Tell me how this contrasts with how Meng Wanzhou was being treated in Canada.
Yeah, I think that the contrast between the presumed treatment of Kovrig and Spavor in some Chinese prison somewhere and that of Meng Wanzhou is quite stark, and I think that's propelled a lot of angry discourse here in Canada. Meng Wanzhou owns 2 multi-million-dollar properties here in Vancouver. She's currently living in one that's just a couple of doors down, actually, from the residence of the United States Consul General. And it's like a $13 or $14 million mansion. It's a beautiful home with a big sweeping circular driveway. And it was recently renovated to accommodate her. And every morning she heads out of this mansion and jumps in her Cadillac Escalade with her security guards, who are actually supposedly to prevent her from escaping, and makes her way to court for these hearings. On a daily basis, she's under a kind of partial house arrest. And what that means is that she's got a GPS tracker strapped to her ankle that prevents her from leaving a certain area around Vancouver. I think it's about 100 square kilometres. And if she does leave it, that sets off all sorts of alarms. She's also prevented from going too close to Vancouver's airport in case she tries to flee. And she, as I said, she's surrounded by these private security guards that she pays for, but are actually acting as representatives of the court who have been charged with preventing her from escaping. And she's under a curfew. But it's kind of a very much a gilded cage that she's in. It is partial house arrest. And, she's not allowed to exactly come and go as she pleases, but she can still go out to restaurants if she wants. She can wander around, she can do shopping, and she can live quite a luxurious life, albeit not a completely free life.
When we talk about house arrest, Ian, you haven't just been in the courtroom to see the proceedings. You've been in Meng Wanzhou's neighborhood. Tell us what you've observed.
Yeah, well, it's a very fancy neighbourhood. This is Shaughnessy, which is probably the one of the most expensive neighbourhoods in all of Canada. Her property is surrounded by other multi-million-dollar estates. Also surrounded by diplomats and things like that. It's a very luxurious neighbourhood. So it is quite a sideshow. The media presence outside her home, especially on big days, for instance, when she's returning to court after a certain gap, there's always a big contingent of reporters there to greet her and say good morning and things like that. But it's also quite unusual, the way that she's treated by the guards, because it does raise questions about whether or not they're actually acting as her jailers or as her bodyguards. And certainly, personally, I've had some interesting interactions with them. I was once outside the front of the house with a Korean film crew, and we went over and we introduced ourselves to the security guards to let them know that we were filming near the house, as we were entitled to do. In a public area. This is a public street, which was fine. But at the same time, we couldn't help but notice one of the security guards was hiding behind, a boat that was parked on a trailer on the street. And the security guard, she was hiding behind the boat, and she was filming us at the same time as we were outside the house. So that's sort of quite an unusual situation. It does raise the question: why are the guards filming us? And it also raised some interesting questions too when it emerged that the exact same security firm that had been hired to jail Meng Wanzhou in her home was also being paid by the Chinese embassy to provide security at the Consulate General here in Vancouver as well. So that also raised some interesting questions.
Can I just check one thing? Have you ever seen or heard of a situation where someone under house arrest, waiting for extradition to another country to face charges, gets to pick or even pay for their own security?
Yeah, this was an interesting question that was raised at Meng's initial bail hearings. The judge in the case eventually weighed in favour of Meng's request that she be allowed to live in this mansion under guard by private security. And there is precedent, albeit not here in Canada. For instance, Bernie Madoff, the Ponzi schemer, he quite famously paid for his own security while he was out on bail, and he had security guards who were acting as sort of officers of the court to prevent him from fleeing. And there were similar questions raised in New York at the time. Were these guards really acting as security guards for him, or were they acting as his jailers, as they were supposed to do? Meng Wanzhou's guards are actually quite friendly. You get very, very familiar with them. And Meng herself is quite friendly with her guards. You see her chatting with them, and they're some of the few people that she sees on a really regular basis, it's a very interesting relationship, I think.
Take us back to the courtroom. It's been over a year of challenges to the extradition request being made by the American authorities. How are the defense challenging this?
Yeah, it's actually challenged American extradition on a few different branches. One branch, which has already been defeated by the Canadian government lawyers who are representing the Americans, was that her lawyers claimed that this case did not pass the test of double criminality for an extradition case. And what that means is that to be extradited for a crime from Canada, the thing that you are accused of has to represent a crime in Canada if it was committed there. And what Meng's lawyers were saying was that it did not pass this test because what she was ultimately being accused of was breaking American sanctions on Iran. Now, the American position is no, that's not the case. What she's actually accused of is fraud, and fraud is a crime in Canada. Now, the judge in the case, the extradition case, ruled in favour of the Americans and the Canadian government, and they said that, yes, this did pass the test of double criminality. So that's strike one for Meng's team. But they've got actually a couple of different, shots in their locker here, so to speak. The other aspects that they're challenging extradition on, one is that the case has become politically tainted, and therefore the case should be thrown out. And the political taint in this case comes in the form of Donald Trump, who weighed in quite famously soon after Meng's arrest and said that he was willing to use her case as leverage against China to further his economic battle with China, to further his trade war with China. And her defence absolutely leapt on this. They said that this represents the political taint that means that this case has to be thrown out because, it's a bogus political case and it's not a criminal case. Another branch that they're trying to challenge on is the so-called abusive process. Abusive process in this case, they're suggesting that what happened to Meng at Vancouver's airport when she arrived wasn't actually a legitimate arrest and immigration process. When Meng was questioned by immigration officers, when they seized her electronic devices, say Meng's lawyers, they were being directed by the American FBI on a covert evidence gathering exercise. Now, the Canadian government lawyers and the police and the border guards involved in this, they deny this. They say they weren't operating as proxies for the FBI, but certainly the FBI was involved to a certain level. The FBI did request that Meng Wanzhou's electronic devices be seized, and they did request that they be put in these special mylar bags to prevent the electronics from being remotely wiped. So a lot of the cases focused on the levels of communication and cooperation between Canadian border guards, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the federal police here, and the American FBI. What was the level of cooperation? What was the level of coordination? And did that, in fact, taint the whole process and taint the way that Meng was handled such that she now has to be released? That's the question that's being asked now.
In the past weeks, you've reported on some major revelations in the courtroom about the handling of Meng Wanzhou's electronic devices, including her phone and laptop when she was arrested. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, the crux of the matter regarding Meng's electronic devices, which was an iPhone, a Huawei phone, a laptop, an iPad, and a memory stick. These were seized. Meng was also asked to provide her passwords for these devices, which she provided to Canada border security agents, border officers who were conducting what they said was an immigration check. What happened, though? After she was arrested, those devices and those passwords were handed on to the police. And this was a no-no. The border guards were not supposed to hand over the passwords, at least. The devices fine, but the passwords were not meant to be passed on. They say this was a mistake. What Meng's lawyers say is that central to this incident was a guy named Ben Chang. Ben Chang was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police financial crimes guy who was in communication with the FBI. Now, whether or not he actually asked for these materials to be provided to the FBI, that's a big bone of contention between both sides. But curiously, Ben Chang is refusing to testify in this case. Ben Chang, it turns out, now works at the Galaxy Casino in Macau, which of course is a Chinese territory. And I found out through court documents that the Canadian government lawyers who are representing American interests in the case said that they actually feared for the safety of Ben Chang, and that provides a big hint as to why he may not be wanting to come back to testify in this case. And also turned out, incidentally, that Ben Chang was actually the Royal Canadian Mounted Police liaison officer in Hong Kong for 4 years. So that helps explain how this mounted policeman ended up working at the Galaxy Casino in Macau, by way of the financial crimes unit of the RCMP and by way of the Meng Wanzhou case.
So where are we right now in this saga? What's the latest?
Yeah, the biggest development actually in recent days came from outside the courtroom. And that was when the Wall Street Journal broke a story which said that Meng Wanzhou and the American Department of Justice were in negotiations to strike a deferred prosecution agreement that would allow her to return home if she agreed to it. Now, in exchange for being allowed to return home, according to the story, was that she would have to make some sort of admission of wrongdoing. And typical for these kind of deferred prosecution agreements, she might also have to offer some sort of cooperation in exchange for the charges against her being dropped at a future date. Now, she returned to court this week. There has been no mention this week so far about this supposed negotiation process. I spoke to the Department of Justice here in Canada, and they said they can't talk about this. What happens between the Americans and Meng Wanzhou is their business. They're just proceeding with the extradition case. But it throws a really interesting spanner in the works. At least from the point of view of the extradition case. Is it all going to be a moot point? Are they going to strike some sort of deal that lets Meng Wanzhou go home? So that was the biggest development in recent days. And so it's almost been difficult to kind of concentrate on the evidence that's been coming out in the extradition hearing because of all the rumours about these discussions.
I know you're not in the business of fortune-telling, Ian, but what happens next? How do you see this playing out over the next few weeks and months?
It would be a very, very brave person to try and predict exactly what's going to happen here, and I'm not that person. But what I would say is that if a deal is not struck, we're going to be talking about this case for years, not months, for years, because this case, the extradition hearings themselves are due to continue into April, into May this year. And regardless of the outcome, you can almost guarantee that there will be some form of appeal from one side or the other. If it goes to that. So I think that there is a bit of a waiting game as to whether or not a deal is struck. But the story of Meng Wanzhou, we called it a saga, it certainly is that. I can almost guarantee we'll still be talking about her in a year's time and in many years to come, in fact.
That's Ian Yang, SCMP correspondent in Vancouver. When he's not reporting on the latest in the Meng Wanzhou case, you can find him on Twitter. He's at Ian James Young 70. That's all we have for this week's edition of Inside China. Don't forget to keep in touch with all the latest as the year 2020 draws to a close. We're almost there in this year where pretty much everybody wants to put behind them. So keep your distance, wash your hands, and stay safe. I am Kinling Lo. Bye for now.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.